Great. Well, a very good morning to all of us here in Dubai, and a good afternoon or a good evening wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this event on ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. My name is Shaun Fitzgerald. I'm director of the Centre for Climate Repair. We're part of the University of Cambridge. I'm also director of research for Cambridge Zero, which is the university's ambitious climate change initiative, which looks at trying to help coordinate multidisciplinary approaches to tackling climate change and multi-institutional endeavours as well. So that looks at trying to bring together different parties, different academic institutions, but other kinds of entities as well, different stakeholders, whether they're policymakers, whether they're businesses, whether they're NGOs, bringing them all together to try and help navigate a future path for humanity and other ecosystems in our fight and our endeavours to tackle climate change. The Centre for Climate Repair, we have three sort of prongs to our strategy, the first of which is the blindingly obvious, but it is deep and rapid emissions reduction. The second, and which is partly why we're here today, is looking at the role of greenhouse gas removals. And then the third one is looking at some climate interventions as, beyond that. We're here this morning to look at ocean-based carbon dioxide removals. And the reason why we are interested in the oceans as a potential pathway for carbon dioxide removal is that a lot of effort has been expended over many years looking at the field of greenhouse gas removal. And there have been various projects, certainly in the United Kingdom, but elsewhere, that have been developing approaches and technologies and furthering our understanding, a lot on land-based terrestrial carbon dioxide removal approaches. And there's been less on the oceans, and actually less on non-CO2 gases. So the Centre for Climate Repair, we've decided to sort of focus our efforts and energies to support the overall field, just trying to further our knowledge base, especially in the oceans, and tackling methane. We're going to be here this morning talking about ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. And what I wanted to first share with you is one of the reasons I get massively excited about the ocean-based carbon dioxide removal is just a simple case of the numbers. So I apologise for this slide perhaps being a little UK-centric. We're a little old island. But if you just go and look at the proportion of the world's surface covered by the UK land, it's a very, very small percentage. It's what 0.05%. If you then went and said, well, hey, what about sort of our own waters around the United Kingdom? Well, you can triple that, so 0.15% as area that's available. If you go and look at sort of our also overseas territories, you get a small number, 1.3%. But the real opportunity is looking at things like international waters. And in broad brush terms, if we want to go and do carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, there are two big challenges ahead. One is you either have to deal with a lot of area and getting nature to do its job for you in terms of getting that air to be in contact with that surface area, or you could expend a lot of energy by moving a lot of air over small amounts of area. So, for example, things like direct air capture. The oceans provide the former in abundance, so 50% of the world's surface ostensibly being international waters, and therefore that being a surface area by which there can be a gaseous exchange between the atmosphere and the water. And then what can we do within the water, a volumetric basis here, to try and look at the sequestration of carbon dioxide. However, where we are today, there are some very significant knowledge gaps, and that's been laid out very nicely by a number of recent reports. We don't really know what we need to know to be able to think about, are any of these approaches really going to be safe for the environment? Are they going to be really effective? Are they going to be scalable? Are they going to be acceptable to wider stakeholders? And indeed, if there are going to be businesses behind this, are there ways in which we can actually have businesses doing this for economic gain as well? Because having come partly from the private sector myself, businesses need to make money. It's basically a license to operate. I used to think money was a dirty word before I got into the private sector, and then I realized actually no, it's a necessary part of being an entity, even if you're there for other reasons, wanting to sort of save the planet and things like that, which is what I did in a former life. No, the only license to operate and get backing is, in fact, there needs to be commercial viability for those entities. So how are we going to tackle the challenge? Well, first of all, we don't do it on our own. So this is why, for example, today we've got groups from around the world working together, and it needs to be multinational and multi-institutional, multi-stakeholder, in other words, the kinds of entities working together to further our knowledge in this space and helping figure out which pathways are the better ones to be pursuing. But fundamentally, where we are today, because the oceans are so sensitive, we need to be incredibly transparent in the way that we operate. So making sure that we expose warts and all, so the good things, the things that we find that are challenging, making sure that we're completely transparent, where the funding comes from, what our scientific findings are. And ultimately, as an engineer, I always like to explore opportunities where there may be pathways for carbon dioxide removal that are just co-benefits themselves of other things that you should be doing, for example, to be a custodian of the oceans. And we're doing that in other areas of our work on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, as well as other greenhouse gas removal pathways, thinking slightly differently. What should you be doing for the environment, for the world, or indeed for other people? Those sorts of activities, and are the carbon dioxide removals just a co-benefit of that? And it's a very strong reason to go and say, look, this is doing what's right. So it's just a sort of a core value, really, do what's right, and clearly that does mean doing what's right for the environment as well. So we're going to be joined this morning by a series of extremely well-informed and exciting speakers. We're going to be first joined by Ken Buesseler from the Woods Hole Institute. He's a senior scientist there who's going to share some insights about some of his work. So Ken, over to you.
Oh, how did I turn that off? Someone's holding up their fingers, so thank you, Shaun. I'm happy to be here. There's my first slide, great. I've got the pleasure of kind of doing an introduction, and for this audience, you've either seen these slides or you know this very well by now, but I think it's worth repeating, and for the online audience as well. The oceans, as we heard, have a big role to play, but before I even say that, this is a slide I like to start with. Someone, I won't say was beating up on me yesterday, but they talk about why do we need CDR? Well, basically there's two things we have to do to get ourselves out of this climate crisis. We're trying to reduce human suffering, environmental losses, and the first one is that darker gray shade emissions reduction. We're at a point in time when we're emitting something like 40 billion tons per year of CO2. We know how we can switch to non-fossil fuel energy sources. That has to be done immediately and substantially. But it'll probably never go that dark gray to zero. There will always be some residual sources, and there's already excess carbon dioxide from human activity in the atmosphere. So that requires some form of carbon dioxide removal if we're going to stabilize our climate. I think that's pretty clear. The timeline that we do that over, not so sure, but certainly we have a little bit of time here to be working on carbon dioxide removal, science, technologies, ways to get that ready so we can implement it as we draw down and reduce our emissions. The blue part, the negative emissions, that will probably never need to be. It can't be as big as the 40, 5, 10 gigatons per year would be quite useful, could get us to the point where we need to be. And so that's what we're looking for here with all of these different methods. How do we remove billions of tons? And I've said this before, I used to have a slide with a train and coal cars, but if you take a train and you're carrying coal in this 15-meter tract and you're pulling along carbon, one coal car is about 104 metric tons of carbon equivalents, and that train would have to circle the equator 4 times to be long enough to carry within those coal cars 1 billion tons of carbon. So these are astronomically big. So we've got a challenge ahead. But I'm pretty optimistic that we actually have ways we could do that, which would involve our friend here, the ocean. as Shaun started to introduce, for area-wise, 2/3 of our planet, half of these waters are international in terms of the ocean, but its capacity is really much bigger than that if you start looking where the carbon ends up that's on this planet and actively recycled. So that deep ocean circle there, these are not to scale, but 37,000 tons, gigatons, billion tons of carbon are stored there, mostly dissolved in organic, but some organic carbon. So that's the biggest number in this type of analyses. If you look at the atmosphere, it's about 50 times smaller. So that is what we're perturbing. We're trying to reduce that. You look at all of the land plants. We're going to talk about oceans. But all of the land plants, all of the soils, the active carbon, that's about 15 times smaller as well. So we have to consider the ocean. Another one I like to point out, blue carbon primarily refers to coastal mangroves, salt marshes, and things. There's all kinds of good reasons to preserve those resources, maybe try to increase that number. But in terms of total storage, it's still a very small fraction of the stored carbon. So we've got to start looking deeper, looking to the interior of the ocean to resolve some of this. I had the good fortune then, right on early 2020, right as COVID was kicking in, got invited to be part of a 12-person group that said we were tasked basically with these 6 particular CDR approaches. There are others for the marine environment. And we were said, well, what is the state of the science? What would the R&D program look like? What were the costs? And so we gathered virtually together for too many hours of Zoom that I'd like to admit. But we looked at these, produced a report that's now a couple years old. I just had to remind myself. But we looked at these 6 on the left, the nature-based types of solutions, on the right, more engineered. There's even debate about that. But basically on the left, we're using plant growth primarily, either in the form of macroalgae seaweed to take up CO2 and then somehow get that deep enough to be sequestered. That's part of the challenge. We know how to grow seaweed, but how would we get it permanently or durably sequestered? I'll talk in the next 4 slides about ocean iron, nutrient addition, a very, I would say, simple and easy way to enhance productivity in some parts of the ocean. So we'll talk about that. You could bring up deep water from ocean with ocean tube type of technology, passive pumping, but that brings up dissolved inorganic carbon from that big interior. So I find that more challenging. That's why the circle's a bit smaller. We all want ecosystem recovery, or at least I do, 30 by 30, these types of ideas, protecting our oceans, building up biomass, restoring what was there, but that's hard to get to the billion ton per year range, maybe a couple 100 million. Again, good reason. And then I don't have time to talk about all these. Like I said, I'm going to talk just about iron, but alkalinity, you can grind up rocks, you can put minerals in the ocean to change that chemistry so more of the atmospheric CO2 gets into the ocean. You can do that electrochemically, but that takes a large amount of energy and power. So both of those are there. Someone was telling me that alkalinity is really, it's just enhancing, weathering, speeding that up. So that's, in their mind, a nature-based solution as well. So I'm not going to debate about that, but those were the 6 we looked at. I only have time to talk about what I've been working on. I've been a scientist for over 35 years studying the biological carbon pump. Where does carbon go after photosynthesis takes place? And what John Martin taught us was that a little iron can go a long way. And 13 experiments were designed to take us into the ocean. 15, 20 years ago, we were doing this, adding iron off the back of a ship, a form of iron sulfate, and seeing the water turn green, basically. You could see that in the jars, in the incubators, and you could see it from space. That's an image from the Soirée experiment there on the right, 60 south, if you can't read that. Largely, that growth, particularly in the Southern Ocean, is dominated by diatoms, that's a ketospheres there, that pick up and have very quick growth rates, doubling times a day or 2. So that was the response we saw, completely successful. We put in the last US experiment, SOFEX, about 1.3 tons of iron, and ended up our measurements of removal out of the surface. This wasn't durable yet. That's the next slide, but about 2,000 tons of carbon. And all that news about Iceland and direct air capture, and they're working in CO2 units. They got 1,000 tons of CO2. Maybe someone can tell me how long that took them. I actually don't know. But in 30 days, we were getting 2,000 tons of carbon, 8,000 tons of CO2. So it can be effective in the surface. But we weren't designing those experiments to look at this question: how deep does it go? This additional carbon, is it, for longer time scales, the durability issue, secured in those deeper layers of the ocean? Because as any oceanographer knows, there's some depth horizons here. We know this really quite well from our physical models, but basically tested against things like input of tritium and carbon-14 from nuclear weapons testing. So we know kind of ages in the ocean, return time to the surface, and this is just very simple schematic. I could show you the maps that people like Dave Siegel have published. But you get down below about 500 to 1,000 meters, and you're talking at least a century before that returns, and millennia if you get to some places in terms of the deeper waters. We don't have to bury it, and this is not permanent in that sense. There's only a small fraction of the carbon that actually gets buried, usually less than 1%. But we're talking after a diatom bloom, you can get 30, 40, 50% of the carbon down into these layers. The average, John Martin's work again, is about 10% gets down below 1,000 meters. But these diatom-induced blooms, or iron-induced diatom blooms, I'm sorry, I think that ratio is going to be much higher, and these next generation experiments could be much longer and larger to see these effects, to actually quantify those efficiencies. So with that in mind, I pulled together some of the people from the early experiments, and we've expanded out to about 25 institutions. More than 50 of us have a pretty regular pattern. The third Monday of every month, you can log in, see our forums. We talk about the different issues about durability, about scaling, ecological impacts. We're intentionally trying to get more diatoms to grow in these areas, to carry that carbon, but there are other side effects that we need to be aware of, measure. Some of that was done in the past. I think we could do more of that. Ultimately, cost will matter. How can you do this efficiently from that standard if businesses get stood up? And then my last slide will be about how we do this, the standards, the ethical way we're going to do that. So that's in this. This is only about a month old, this report. I've got copies, and with the QR code, you can find this online. But that lays out a plan for EXOIS, exploring ocean iron solutions, we call ourselves, with an emphasis on that first word. This is about science. This is about research. It's exploring. We do not have the answer. We're not selling carbon credits. We're not on a market, but we are trying to find funds to do this kind of research, get back in the field, get wet, learn through experience. So I'll end with this. This was quite important. This was probably the first thing we did. We got together with some of the ocean NGOs. Margaret Leinen was talking about this 15, 20 years ago. She helped us come up with this guiding principles. I'm sure several of you know all the different ones that have come out. This is a simplification of what we published in 2022, but it's basically saying, first and foremost, why we're doing this, the benefit of humans and the environment, making sure we have a clear line of responsibility. Some of that would involve permitting under the London Convention, London Protocols. In our case, commitment to open research. As a scientist, that seems so obvious, but that's not always what has happened. Iterative independent assessments are needed, so it won't be just our word. Certainly things like peer-reviewed literature are one way, but inviting anyone to join us if we go out in the field, when you can't physically stop people from joining you, but we want to encourage people actually to join in those experiments, even if they're not part of the core group. And of course, the last one is very important, finding ways to reach the public, make sure they know why we're doing this, the need for that, and get some feedback. We're not asking for their permission. We will under the processes like the assessment through the London Protocols, but make sure people are aware of why we think this is needed and implementation over the next 5 or 10 years to fill in that first slide, that darker blue gap for carbon removal. Iron, we estimate, could remove on order of a billion tons per year. If you take the gyres, something I haven't talked about here, areas that are low in nutrients, you can also stimulate nitrogen fixation. That has not been studied in those 13 experiments. So there is additional room for capacity that we haven't looked at, but we might not want to do this everywhere at scale, and we likely won't have to reach that number. So with that, I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Ken, thank you ever so much indeed. So food for thought for us, and we will come back in a panel discussion towards the end of this session. We're now going to be joined by Romany Webb. Romany is Deputy Director for the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University in the United States. So I was wondering whether we could get Romany on the screen with slides, please. Perfect. So Romany, over to you. I'm hoping you've got control of your slides.
I don't believe I do have control of my slides, but hopefully somebody can advance them if I just...
Okay, and if we could make Romany just a bit louder, please.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. I'm sorry not to be there in person, but I am happy to have the opportunity to speak to you remotely from New York. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the governance of ocean-based carbon removal. I'll say a few words about some of the existing governance frameworks that are currently in place and explain why, in my view, they're not currently fit for purpose and need some reconsideration. So if we can go to the first slide, please. I can actually no longer see the slides on the screen, so maybe someone can interrupt me if you're not seeing slides. So before I get into the governance questions, I just want to reiterate a couple of the points that have been made. You know, Ken, I think, laid out really nicely the need for carbon dioxide removal as part of our climate change toolkit, along with emissions reductions. The ocean-based carbon dioxide removal approaches are receiving a lot of attention. They appear to hold quite a lot of promise. But as Ken laid out, there are important unanswered questions about their efficacy, their benefits, and their risks. And so there is a need for much greater research in this space. Governments around the world, here in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere, are providing significant funding for research, though more is, of course, needed. We're also seeing in many places a lot of corporate activity in the space, you know, a growing number of new startups and other entities that are looking to test and ultimately sort of commercialize these techniques. And so we're really on the cusp of what I would argue is a new industry around ocean-based carbon solutions and ocean CDR in particular. How that industry develops will have huge implications, not only for efforts to address climate change, but also for sort of broader goals around sustainable development. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I just want to very briefly touch on some of the potential interactions between ocean CDR and the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, at the most general level, we know that climate change threatens achievement of the SDGs. And so to the extent that ocean-based carbon removal helps to mitigate climate change, it also helps to sort of reduce that threat and advance the goals. But beyond that, individual CDR approaches may have different implications for different SDGs, helping to advance some and also detract from others. So if you think about, Ken mentioned seaweed cultivation. If you think about you know, expanding seaweed cultivation, that could help to advance SDG 8 around decent work by providing additional employment opportunities for people in coastal communities. Currently in the Global South, seaweed farming is often performed by women, so expanding that industry could help to advance SDG 5 on gender equality. Could also have benefits for SDG 14 on life below Earth. You know, depending on where they are, seaweed farms can help to improve the health of marine ecosystems, provide habitat for marine species, help to combat coastal eutrophication and other issues. At the same time, however, seaweed cultivation, particularly at large scales, can also present risks. There have been concerns expressed about the introduction of non-native species, about the potential for pollution, and other things that could actually detract from the achievement of SDG 14. And the same is likely to be true for other ocean CDR approaches where you know, they may both advance and hinder different SDGs. And so in this context, it's really important that we have effective governance frameworks that fully account for both the benefits and the risks that these activities present and ensure that they occur in a way that is safe and responsible, that maximizes those benefits and that minimizes those risks. So if we go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to dive into the details of this, but the point here is just to note that if we think about the existing governance framework within which these activities are happening, the global climate change regime is obviously really important. In many cases, we would be doing these activities with the prime goal of mitigating climate change. And the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement recognize carbon removal as a means of mitigating climate change. And I'll say more about this in a minute, but really sort of emphasize the importance of doing this and arguably actually impose an obligation on countries to do this. The UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement don't, however, set out detailed rules around sort of when, where, and how you should be pursuing different approaches and individual projects. And so if we go to the next slide, please. There is actually currently no comprehensive international legal regime that's specific to ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. There are no legally binding international agreements that are tailored specifically for ocean CDR. There are, though, a number of agreements that deal generally with things like marine access, marine pollution, species protection, and other topics that are relevant to and will have implications for ocean CDR. And so you see some examples on this slide: the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the new BBNJ Treaty on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the London Convention and Protocol. The parties to some of these instruments have adopted decisions and resolutions dealing with certain ocean CDR activities, often referred to as marine geoengineering activities. And those decisions and resolutions have generally approached ocean CDR or marine geoengineering from a position of strong skepticism. They have focused solely on the risks that these activities present and not considered their potential benefits. And so unsurprisingly, you see in these decisions a very sort of restrictive approach to ocean CDR activities. Go to the next slide, please. Most recently, in October this year, the parties to the London Convention and Protocol adopted a statement on marine geoengineering, which focused on 4 specific approaches, including seaweed cultivation and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And in this statement that was issued by the parties, they concluded that there is a lot of uncertainty around the effects of these activities, but they have the potential for deleterious effects that are widespread, long-lasting, or severe. And so given that, the parties said that marine geoengineering activities other than legitimate scientific research should be deferred. The parties have previously adopted a framework for assessing whether projects constitute legitimate scientific research, and it is in many ways quite restrictive. Requires projects to be relatively small and, importantly, to have no commercial element to them. And that's raised a lot of eyebrows, particularly here in the US, where we are seeing a lot of research being advanced by private sector entities. And there's a lot of questions about whether this restriction on sort of commercial activities might hinder or prevent that research from moving forward. The parties have justified this approach by pointing to those uncertainties and risks around marine geoengineering activities and saying that given that, they will take a precautionary approach and restrict these activities. And to some, that might seem entirely appropriate and fully consistent with the precautionary principle that underlies much of international environmental law. But I would argue that it's actually a very narrow application of the precautionary principle. So if we go to the next slide, please. The best known articulation of the precautionary principle is found in the Rio Declaration, and it says, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. And a version of this was incorporated into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Article 3 says that parties are required to take precautionary measures to address climate change, and where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing those measures. As we've seen over the last year, we're now at a point where climate change is having serious and irreversible effects. And so it could be argued that the lack of full scientific certainty around the impacts and efficacy of these ocean CDR approaches isn't a reason to restrict research into them. In fact, arguably under this provision of the UNFCCC, parties have an obligation to move ahead with that research. So we see this disconnect between the global climate regime, which sort of supports these activities, and the global ocean regime, which is very much restrictive, very restrictive of them. And so we really need to rethink the way that we govern these activities and how we can establish a more effective international governance regime for them. And I would argue that we should start with by looking at the way we consider the benefits and the risks of these different activities. Currently in the global ocean context, we see a real emphasis on the risks and no consideration given to the potential benefits of these activities. And what we really need is a balance between the two. I think I'm probably out of time, so I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion at the end.
Many thanks indeed. Great. We will bring you back, Romany, for the discussion afterwards. So thanks ever so much. We're now going to be followed by Leonardo Valenzuela Perez, Director of International Partnerships at Ocean Visions. So, Leonardo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shaun, and thanks everyone here today for this session. And wonderful to follow Romany's words here. She mentioned some of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think one that was not highlighted there, but it's very important for what's ahead for this massive endeavor, which will be to prove these technologies, to advance them, to scale these partnerships. So partnerships for the Sustainable Development Goals are fundamental, partnerships in science, partnership between sectors, and also to move beyond the adversarial take on this, because what we are trying to do now is to advance science, to prove these solutions, and that requires collaboration and requires building trust. So having said that, I'm here representing Ocean Visions, and I will focus this presentation on the high-level roadmap that we have been working on that was launched a few weeks ago. There you have very clearly stated the website, and this I will get into the details of the roadmap. And that, yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah. So first, Ocean Visions was created. It's a non-profit organization, first of all. That's a very important piece. And it was created to catalyze efforts, catalyze collaborations, to design and develop solutions for climate change. This is a broad agenda, and one of the major strengths of Ocean Visions is its network. So we are at the center of this network. We articulate several actors to advance these efforts. All with their own strengths, and I think that's, again, talking about partnerships, a fundamental piece of the work that we are doing. And just to go into our agenda, so we know that emission reductions alone are not doing, not getting the job done for climate, and we know that the climate crisis is an ocean crisis. So many of the elements that are causing a major disruption in the ocean are related to climate issues, and particularly to emissions. And Ken was deeper into that area, so I will not reiterate what I think we have been repeating over and over. So I will just go into what the agenda is trying to do now. So we work in areas that are underinvested and areas where there is more potential. So the first area of this program, of this 4R program, is reduction. So in reduction, we are focused on decarbonization. And this is, again, to reiterate that this is not a competing agenda with the rest of the climate agenda. This is an agenda that is complementary. And the other area where we're working, which is what we're here for, is removals. And again, follows a very similar sequence to what Shaun mentioned before. And then repair, which is to get into the most advanced pieces on how do we prevent tipping points, and reach, which is an area where I'm working, and I think I will touch now on like the reach and remove relation, which is to advance CDR, to advance these possibilities. We need to build a global community around this, a global community of science and a global community for an understanding of the science and technology efforts and what it takes to materialize them. So we, by now, are getting to an agreement that from all the agendas in climate mitigation, removals are becoming non-optional. Now the main question is this non-optional piece, what components will it have? We believe that most, or not most, but a large part of the potential relies on the ocean, but that has its own challenges, and advancing understanding to address those challenges is a big part of what needs to be done over the next decade. So there are some accounts of how we are doing to CDR to date, like the State of CDR report, and then there are a few other pieces around this. We know that this is still nascent, it's novel, that those are some of the adjectives used around this. So a lot more needs to be done if we want this to be like reality. And this, a disclaimer here, or not a disclaimer, but like something important to mention, given how conversations go around COP, which is we hear this idea that CDR should be like used when it's like there is no other way, when we are at the end of our possibilities. I think this is where we need to understand temporality. So in order to have these options, technologies in place, we need time. And we don't have a lot of time already, so there is a need to accelerate all these efforts so that we can get to a point where the engineering is refined and we are doing this in a democratic way, so that there is public understanding, and that is the reason that this needs to be on the agenda. This needs to be discussed now. There is a need for support, but we cannot believe, because this is just a misunderstanding regarding the dynamics of science of technology, that we can just ignore this until we cannot ignore it anymore. So that, I think, is a strong point. So that's just a reiteration of this point. But at Ocean Visions, we have been preparing, like we started with the concept of roadmaps to see how to advance all of these paths. Again, can mention many of them. There is also a certain level of clarity in terms of what the paths are, the specific technologies, and the specificity of each one of them and how they will work. That's something that is under development right now. So this is an example of how we are trying to communicate these issues, how we are trying to get to an understanding of what they could take, even in this visioning aspect of how the entire advancement of the sector, as Romany said, would take. So these are our website. So there are some of these roadmaps where you can find knowledge gaps, you will find main challenges, and all the issues that need to be advanced in order to get each of these technologies or each of these pathways to a point that they could eventually be deployed. But at this point, what we need to do is advance field trials, advance all the elements that are required to prove the pathways. And I think that message must be very clear, that is the goal at the moment. So this high-level roadmap that I mentioned, the whole concept is we have probably, and this is in terms of how the challenge has been framed, we have to till the end of the decade to really get these things going, to get to a point that we can, like the experiments that we have seen, like what can show that like there are efforts to do this. We need to get these efforts together, coordinated. We need to create a large partnership to understand very well what works and what doesn't work, to prioritize resources, and to advance this area. So here are some examples of questions that need to be addressed. So one of them is if marine CDR pathways are generating or are capable of generating measurable reductions in seawater carbon dioxide concentration. That's one fundamental thing. Another one is can net additional ocean uptake of atmospheric carbon dioxide be tracked in response to marine CDR, issues of like MRV, and what are the impacts to marine ecosystems? Like all our roadmaps specify what the main questions are in these areas, and I think we need to do this in an absolute comprehensive way. And also the impacts to human populations and the connection, and that's a strong connection to social sciences and a strong connection to, like once we get to the scale that we're talking about here, we will be seeing major changes and major challenges. So we need to anticipate how that will look like. And issues of scalability that don't require necessarily those field trials that we are talking in the previous questions is a question about the connection to land, like the materials, the logistics. What type of engineering at large scale will be required to get everything in place to deploy things at the scale that we're talking about with marine CDR at the moment. And another one is like the suite of technical, economic, social, and politically enabling conditions. And this is, regulatory. I think it's a major aspect here. So how we will go through this redesign of environmental impact assessments, or not necessarily a redesign, but to understand an industry that follows a logic that is not the same as the logic of the industries for what environmental regulation was created to some extent. Like we're not here in an industry that is looking to extract resources that have, like say mining that has a benefit that goes down the way. Here it's like directly trying to do something to repair the planet, and that really changes the balance of proof in this sense. So some actionable items. So in science, we need these field trials. We need supporting lab and measuring mesocosm studies, MRV, and also social science research. In technology, applications of new technology and knowledge, scaling analysis, and the development of innovation hubs. So innovation hubs as a way to bring this around the world, create collaborations regionally, and advance the science and technology together. That's a big question regarding what's the role of the rest of the world. Like when we're talking from like institutions that are very North-centric, so what kind of mechanisms for collaboration can be funded in order to advance this work? And policy conducive enabling environment. So again, how can we facilitate the advancement of the science through changes and adjustments to existing regulations, or to adapt those regulations? How much it will cost? So this is a major question as well. We saw from the National Academy of Science an initial estimate. We have seen more recent publications coming to higher numbers, and then in Congress now there is a piece that is, it's putting it at 12 billion. And that was like to fund how do we advance this sector. So that gives you a sense of the relevance that it's getting in the mainstream sense, and also the relevance that it's getting on to understand the size of this industry. This is just to prove it. what comes next will also have like that type of scale. Now, and this is a point that to me is very important. I come here as a social scientist, and this change, this potential for this large-scale deployment of mCDR. So let's think down the road. Implies a paradigmatic transformation. So we cannot lose sight of that. Advancing this roadmap, this high-level roadmap, is a way to prove all these areas, and then we also need to understand how do we connect and create bridges with the rest of the climate agenda. So let's not lose sight that we are at COP right now, and what the process of COP is, and how difficult it is to advance small things in these negotiations that are based on consensus. So we are talking here about advancing this type of science and this type of academic, science and technology agenda. So we certainly need to expand intercultural and scientific dialogue to promote or to create the bridges for these roadmaps and for this proving and disproving, as we say, these technologies, the bridging of the agenda, of existing agenda of climate, and how removals fit in there, and how ocean removals fit in there with all the potential benefits that they have, and also the need, very important need to address uncertainties and fears. And that's something where transparency is very necessary. And I think there are plenty of opportunities to expand this program in a way that will gain public support. But to gain public support, the benefits need to be clearly understood, and the transparency of science will be fundamental for that. So thank you very much.
Well, many thanks indeed. A couple of reflections, just short ones anyway. I really like the language of prove and disprove that has been laid out there. But what I really appreciate about that language is what actually is implied by that, which is we don't know actually which ones might be better than others. And actually, whether they're going to be acceptable or not. So it's not coming with any precast judgments on any of these approaches, but also laying out the steps that are going to be needed to try and actually further our knowledge base on that. And there is a project that's been funded by Horizon Europe. It's a €7 million funded project over 4 years, and this project is really looking at how we can develop a framework by which different ocean-based carbon dioxide removals approaches can be compared. Because, as Romany mentioned, it may not be a case of being able to prove something or disprove something in absolute terms, but better constraining our levels of uncertainty on risks and benefits associated with each of these. And this project is being led by the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton. Chris Pearce is the principal investigator. It brings together a number of parties, and it's looking at different stakeholders. So our next two speakers are from the entities being represented by Chris Pearce's organisation. We're first going to be joined by Chelsey Baker from the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton. Chelsey, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so it's very nice to be here. So I'm going to very briefly talk about assessing the efficacy, impacts, and durability of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. So I'm an ocean biogeochemical modeler by trade at the National Oceanography Centre, so that's sort of the flavour of this talk. I'm not going to reiterate a lot of the ground that's already been covered, but I just wanted to put up this cover from the emissions gap report that came out this year called Broken Record, and their tagline is temperatures hit new highs, yet world fails to cut emissions again. And I think that just reiterates that we need drastic emissions reduction first and foremost. But they also have this quote in the report that says, under current or planned emission reduction efforts, the expanded use of carbon dioxide removal is unavoidable if the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal is to remain within reach. So we need CDR, and the ocean is one area that we can explore for that, but it's not the only area either, and we need to keep that in mind. You've seen various iterations of this type of diagram now, so I'm not going to go through the approaches, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of points. So one of them is that for the sort of biomass-related approaches, the way that the carbon storage will happen with that is that we need to get this organic material from the surface down deep into the ocean, and then know how long it is stored there for. In contrast, for the approaches such as like ocean alkalinity enhancement, it's how long these waters with increased alkalinity actually stay at the surface and can take up the carbon dioxide. So there's very different things we need to consider when we assess these different approaches. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is that it's not only the approaches that we need to consider, but actually the way they're deployed, because changes in deployment strategy can really change the processes that we need to consider, the feedbacks and what the impacts might be. And as I see new deployment strategies and approaches kind of growing all the time, and so the landscape seems that it's only getting bigger and bigger. But we do need to try and assess these approaches and deployment strategies rapidly. So when we're thinking about assessing and monitoring ocean-based carbon dioxide removal approaches, I wanted to kind of highlight the time and space scales that we need to think about, because they are quite different at different points. So I'm not talking about any specific approach here, but it's more of a general view. So you will have the deployment site and you will immediately need some measurements. So that might be physical samples, at the research sort of trial or small scale trial stage. Then you want to kind of track what the perturbation is, and that might be on longer time scales, so weeks to months. And for that, you might want to make use of autonomy, drifters, satellites. But I'm a modeler, so I also want to highlight the role of modeling here, that can go from deployment, short time scale, so that could be using regional ocean models, but it can also go to global long time scales, so that could be using Earth system models that have coupled ocean, atmosphere, land, and the feedbacks between them, because if you want to think about scalability and then what the impacts will be to the Earth system, you need to not only consider the ocean and the atmosphere, but also some of the wider impacts. So the way I see it is that models can kind of fill in some of the gaps. We can't measure everywhere all the time as much as we'd like to, and the one place that we really can't measure is the future, and so we have to be able to have prediction capabilities as well. And also models allow us to trial different scenarios, so what happens if we add alkalinity all along the shelves or across the surface open ocean? What happens if we do add iron or have macroalgae growth and sinking? So we can trial different scenarios, but the tools that we have at the moment weren't really designed necessarily to answer some of these questions. And so that's where I think as well the small scale trials and knowing the results of that, what impacts we see, some we may expect and some we actually may not, that may then drive some model development to include processes that currently aren't represented. So I wanted to highlight that I think modelling has a key role at several stages. That's assessing the efficacy, durability, and then the scalability of the different approaches. We need to evaluate what the ecosystem and downstream impacts and also co-benefits might be. And they can support robust monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is really important as well. So I just wanted to briefly highlight some work that was published last year. So we used a modeling approach to track the fate of interior ocean carbon, and that we tracked it for 100 years to see what the sort of sequestration efficiency is. And so what we found is that this was just for the North Atlantic, but actually the durability of carbon storage was highly dependent on the depth and also the location. So the spatial pattern was very interesting. And that was also shown by Dave Siegel's paper as well, but they used a different modeling approach. And I think what we have to highlight here is that we can't only use one model and one study, but actually models have different strengths and weaknesses, and getting an idea of the range of these sort of estimates and also what the uncertainty is will be really important for when we're thinking about the durability and permanence of carbon storage. So this is just sort of a wrap-up slide that we need to think about the efficacy, we need to think about the impacts, and we need to think about the permanence when we're evaluating these ocean-based carbon dioxide removal approaches. So we need robust cooperative monitoring, reporting, and verification. We need to protect critical ocean ecosystems that already do a lot to moderate our climate. And we need to ensure that we know what we're doing so that we're actually making measurable progress towards net negative emissions. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, and now we're going to be joined by Paul. They've just communicated to me for the first time that we're supposed to be finishing at 9 o'clock. I was told it was an hour and a half. So they've allowed us to have 5 or 10 minutes extra. So I don't know what's gone on in the communications. So I apologize for that. Over, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks for organizing this, Shaun. And this has been a great series of presentations that really dovetail nicely together. So let's move quickly into what we do at the World Ocean Council. And I'll just preface it, particularly having heard from Romany, this is really from an old guard perspective, I'm finding out. So I was involved in pre-COP0, if you could believe that, back helping the Pacific Island delegations in the negotiations of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I was involved in the Convention on Biological Diversity when precautionary approach was being debated as a part of international treaties. So seeing where we are now and how we need to adapt these long-standing portions of the international context to the challenges of using the ocean to sequester carbon and address the climate crisis. So what I do now with the World Ocean Council is the global business organization for the blue economy, for sustainability in the ocean, harnessing the role of the different sectors to work together. And part of that, and this is I start with my concluding slide, Shaun, so that's, we're on the right track here, to bring together the business community in general around ocean sustainable development, in particular focusing here on then the business of carbon sequestration in the ocean. So blue carbon, but mainly more the open ocean carbon that we've heard so much about this morning, these great presentations. And so this is really the summary of where we're at and where we're going in terms of creating a business association. And Romany said, it seems like this is a new industry, and in fact, that's what we're doing. We've been pulling together these companies for many years. Personally, I've been involved in this space since the 2000s when the iron fertilization sort of controversy over geoengineering was going, and then got going, and then with the World Ocean Council for over a dozen years, we've started to pull together the enterprises that are developing the commercial development and application of these approaches, and moving towards creating that community of practice, and maybe even formalizing it into, if and as a critical mass of companies want this, a kind of an industry association that will help provide standards, exchange of best practices, a common voice to engage the other stakeholders. As Leo and others have said, it's all about partnerships. And also then importantly, engaging the investment community. We've been bringing in the investors to learn about the different pathways and the technologies and the companies that are involved. That's the supply side, and a real simple way of looking at this is supply, demand, and what are the enabling conditions. And so on the demand side, our core strength is the corporate business community, the corporations that make up the global ocean business community and investment community. And so on the demand side, really, and I've had some great discussions this week, again, of companies in the maritime industries that are having to that are working to develop their net zero strategies, purchasing credits, having carbon removal as a part of those strategies is really important. And so connecting them to the ocean opportunities for sequestration, kind of an ocean-to-ocean connection on supply and demand, is something that's really resonating with them. And just last night at the International Chamber of Shipping event, for example, speaking with a lot of the shipping companies about this, and it really resonates with them as ocean industry people. And there's a whole series of other connections with the business community in terms of how we deploy carbon sequestration in the ocean, and it's been implied in a lot of the diagrams you've seen. There have been ships, there's been pipelines going out into the water. Those are all companies and industries. So the desalination industry, for example, has large pipelines that discharge into the ocean, and so how do we work with them? The shipping industry, the mining industry, the ports, et cetera. So there's all of that surrounding ecosystem in the business community that needs to be engaged here to operationalize this as we move forward. Clearly, though, dealing with all of those uncertainties, those challenges, the partnerships, the communication, and et cetera, that you've been hearing about this morning. The monitoring, reporting, and verification has come up as a critical part of this. The business community, the companies that are moving into this space, they understand this as essential, of course, to what they need to do. And many companies then have their own work in this, and we're starting to, and others now are moving into, thankfully, to help sort of coordinate that this MRV work really does connect up across the pathways as they've been referred to, as you've heard today, the different pathways across the broader marine and coastal CDR context and linking to the kinds of standards and protocols necessary overall for CO2 removal for the kinds of reasons and that the science and technology people here have really articulated well. So just to give you a sense, and I won't dwell on this, of who we are. So we are the only global business and investment organization for ocean sustainable development and the blue economy, with some 35,000 companies, industry associations, investment firms, et cetera, in our global network, focusing on bringing that community together around developing and implementing and driving and leading the actions needed to ensure we've got a healthy ocean. This is and I'm just going to quickly jump forward here. We've heard about all of this morning, and you will have, and we've seen this many times, so you're familiar with that, and this is great. And this sort of work has really set the stage for understanding this, and I really like to put this in front, and we get this in front of investors, in front of the maritime industries, just the pure scale of this. And that's when I say to people, particularly when I'm talking to industry audiences, that if they remember nothing else, remember the scale of the opportunity that the ocean presents us in terms of CDR, that this is what we need to focus on as a planet, and not misunderstanding this opportunity and realizing it. So lastly, let me just really then focus a little bit more on this, what we're doing with the business and investment community, getting these different players together. As I say, the focus here is on really how do we operationalize a collective effort? What are the pre-competitive collaboration needs and opportunities here? Both, as I say, the enterprises themselves, the associated industries that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the investment community, and then the marketplace in terms of how this is all going to reach the potential for establishing credits that can be traded as we move forward. And success looks like having this business and investment community well organized, working together to engage in delivering these outputs with, again, all of these enabling conditions we've talked about, the science, the technology, the policy, the governance, and just to focus on just a couple of key points that have come out of our ongoing meetings and discussions with the enterprises. The core of this is the group of growing number of marine carbon dioxide removal enterprises. Important issues are, and this came up from some of the earlier presentations, but they really are at the pointy end of this, the social license, engaging the public, and so we need that monitoring, reporting, and verification. We need the communication tools and partners to really ensure that people understand, and especially policymakers understand, as Shaun was saying, not only, and Romany, not only the risks, but also the benefits. Very science and data driven. The modeling is going to be really important on this in terms of unintended consequences, the lack or presence thereof. These are some of the key issues, and then that comes down into a regulatory process. What's the regulatory framework? These companies are all starting to grapple with this as they start to get, and I got to say, the last couple of years has really been exciting. There's hardware being deployed now, prototype instrumentation or technology getting deployed into the water. This is a new industry. It's starting to deploy. We need to get that policy and regulatory and social license context sorted out so that we don't lose time on this and figure out, is this stuff really going to work? How much of it, when and where, to really move this all forward. So this is the slide that we started with. This is where we're going in terms of engaging the business and investment community with this new industry and the role of the ocean in really tackling our increasingly dire climate crisis. Thanks very much.
Great. Can I just ask the panelists to come to the front? We've got maximum 10 minutes just for some Q&A, and then we'll have a hard stop at 9:15. So the rules of the game for Q&A, questions from the floor, very short, questions and answers from the panel. If you can't do it in less than a minute, don't try and answer it. I want really short answers from the floor as well. So questions from the floor. Anyone? Otherwise, I'll pose some. Right, quick question. What's the future for MRV? Is there a future beyond being able to do something at a more holistic level rather than just individual projects? So is science going to be able to allow us to have a more autonomous, holistic view of MRV?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a really short answer, Ken. You're allowed a few more seconds, could you?
And I'd like to point out that it's not just tracking carbon, it's the environmental, ecological consequences. So a small e in front of that is needed as well. So both of those things can be done now remotely, autonomously, and need to be part of any sort of future research and hopefully commercial efforts to monetize this.
Great, okay.
And I just add that a lot of the defining the very specific tasks and questions to have the companies really help need to drive that, and they've got some of them. The staffing of these companies is got a large number of scientists on it. They are very science-driven companies, and to have them help define the very specific questions that the science and technology community needs to be addressing and developing. For example, MRV is an underlying enabling condition here.
Great. Leonardo?
Just a side thing to that, which is one of the co-benefits of advancing all the MRV and advancing all these efforts is that there will be an increase in ocean science and ocean science infrastructure. And I think that will be very positive for all sectors, and that will be transformational.
Great. Chelsey?
And I think also we need good monitoring to ensure that any downstream impacts don't then counteract what we've done. So that's how we need to know it's additional, that by, if we do nutrients somewhere and then they're not elsewhere, that we've actually not impacted the ecosystem downstream. So I think that's really important.
Great. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, take a mic for the lady. Name and affiliation, please.
Okay, I'm Mikako from Japan. I'm a TNFD Task Force alternate member.
Yep.
And my question is about about more governance issue, because you mentioned about the coastal type of thing too, and coastal kind of CDR is all under so-called national jurisdiction. But so this is all, in a sense, free. In a sense, every corporate or every kind of effort can be done at this day. But about ocean, that means high seas.
Yep.
So what we should talk about is all about high seas and not about national jurisdiction. Is that correct understanding?
I'm going to ask Romany, I'm going to bring Romany into the room, as it were, please. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of these approaches could be deployed in nearshore coastal areas within the EEZs of a country. And even if we're talking about activities occurring on the high seas, that would still be subject to national regulation. If you're using a vessel registered in the United States, you'd be subject to US regulation. But international law does have a more important role to play for high seas activities, and there are particularly important implications of the new high seas treaty, for example.
Okay.
But the reality is, in the short term, that companies are looking into national waters because that's the place that they can sort out the regulatory and policy conditions. But as a planet, we're going to have to sort out the high seas part of it. And even within the national jurisdictions, we want to be doing that in a way that's compatible and comparable around different countries. We don't want to have to do this each time in each country separately.
Perfect. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, we'll take a microphone to the gentleman. Name and affiliation, please.
Alan Owens from the National Oceanography Centre in the UK. It's following on from the governance question, and we've alluded to the BBNJ. You opened your initial slide with 50% of the ocean is in areas of the high seas. That's where the biggest impact is going to happen. We do have the BBNJ, which has an EIA provision. Now, is that EIA provision going to be able to be achieved, for want of a better word, if the science isn't there to demonstrate what the impacts could be?
Who would like to have a crack at this? Ken?
I will just
or Romany, please.
Ken can follow up. I just wanted to very quickly say that the EIA provisions in the BBNJ are hugely important, and I think could be hugely impactful here. They have a number of advantages over sort of other EIA provisions that we see in other legal regimes. But there is still, even with that, a lot of flexibility for countries to decide. The mere fact that you have to do an EIA for an activity, and that EIA shows that there are negative environmental consequences, that does not dictate the outcome of the decision or mean that that activity can't go ahead. It's a decision-making tool, but it doesn't dictate the outcome.
And Ken?
just something I don't understand yet is if you have a coastal deployment, say ocean alkalinity on a beach, that water is going to move offshore pretty quickly. So don't we have to consider that as well? And maybe that's a question more than...
Romany, would you like to comment on that, which is the artificial border?
Yes. The EIA provisions in the BBNJ specifically say that you have to do it even if you're not doing an activity in high seas areas, if it could have impacts on high seas areas. So that captures a very large number of activities, including some that are very
and this is
coastal
really
areas,
important for the companies, and I've been involved in that BBNJ process for a dozen years. The businesses of the world, when they saw that provision in their Romany, it really opened up. So although it's BBNJ, it's high seas, international waters, effectively, functionally, as you're saying, Romany, it covers the entire global ocean basins. And it's a really challenging issue to address, Alan, because then people are worried that anything they do anywhere in the ocean potentially comes in under the EIA provisions of BBNJ. There's a lot to be sorted out there. We've got an EIA business working group now in relation to the BBNJ to start unpacking that and bringing the industry and the EIA practitioner input to the governments, to the policymakers, so that we have a very active, constructive, broad partnership of dialogue, because this is going to affect how business is done in the ocean for decades and decades to come.
Okay, one final question from the floor, if there is one. Okay, what I would like to do now is to thank our wonderful panel for this morning. Really sorry to have sort of railroaded us into a short bit at the end, but I'm very, very grateful to you for your time this morning, for your insights. And I think the future of marine-based carbon dioxide removal is bright in terms of at least, furthering our understanding of the opportunity. But as I said, I think the opportunity is huge, which is why I'm excited about it. But we do need to sort of increase our levels of knowledge, and therefore to reduce our levels of uncertainty on the risks and benefits, as Romany, for example, laid out in her presentation. Thanks ever so much indeed, everybody, for your time this morning. Bye-bye.